Sup people, welcome to 1000 Words. My name is Radu, I'm a street photographer from Romania, and today I want to talk to you about how I set up my camera for street photography. Specifically, this is the Sony a7R III with vintage glass, currently the Porst color reflex, 50mm f1.7. The gist of it is that I auto all the digital things basically, so that makes this almost like a fully manual, fully analog, almost like a film camera. Bold claims, I know. But before getting into the meat and potatoes of this video, kindly consider joining my Discord server. It's loosely based around the theme of this channel. However, you don't necessarily need to be subscribed to the channel, although I would appreciate it. But join us there. We already have quite a handful of very quality people. Most of them are handpicked by myself, so I can vouch for them. But even those I have not personally added to the group are what appear to be very nice, good people. So hopefully I'll see you there. While I'm very much of a nerd, quite big into tech and gadgets and computers. I mean, I love all of this. I'm also very nostalgic at heart. I love an analog experience. I love film cameras. And I'm trying to make this into as much an analog experience as humanly possible, seeing how this is very much a computer that makes pictures. That said, this is only meant to basically play the algorithm, because no photographer worth his salt doesn't have a how I set up my camera video. But more so than not, I'm hoping this is useful, because there is a lot of talk on the internet about cameras with feeling, about the experience of photography, and certainly this is something very important to me. I talked about this in a previous video where I talked about, I think it was the manual focus video. I talked about how if it weren't for the actual physical experience of turning rings and wheels and pressing buttons and turning knobs, if it weren't for the heft, the weight, the smell, the feeling, the tactile experience of photography, I wouldn't be doing it in the first place. I know pictures are what's important, but for me, at least half of it is my experience in getting those pictures. So, considering that, I tried to limit the amount of menu hopping that I need to do. So basically, I don't go into the menus except when either when I need to format the card, or when I'm having new ideas about how to further customize the camera, because this is a work in progress still. It's not a finished project. So although I have got it in a state where I'm quite happy with it, and if we're talking about actual shooting, actual taking of photographs, I don't ever go into the menus. I don't ever go into the function menu. Some people call it the fun menu. I'm talking about this function button here. I only just use the hardware buttons and dials on the camera, the rings on the lens, and nothing else. For me, that's a beautiful way of using a camera, and that also helps to alleviate my terrible, terrible gas. And no, my stomach is just fine. What's not fine is the fact that I always dream about new cameras. I dream about the Nikon ZF. I dream about Fuji. Still I dream about Fuji. I dream about Olympus. I dream about a lot of cameras I don't own. I dream about the perfect camera While this may seem trivial for some, simply inconceivable for others, because I know quite a handful of photographers, especially the working professionals among them, simply see these as tools and couldn't care less how it feels, how it looks, and if it's a Sony or a Canon. They just care that it gets the job done and it gets the job done well. Me, I'm different like that. I like the experience, I like the handling, and I like to like this. I want to have such an experience that makes me enjoy using the camera, looking at it, holding it, because all this pleasant experience helps to inspire me, or at the very least helps to motivate me to go out to shoot. That said, let's switch to a top-down view and let me take you around the camera and tell you how I set up everything in order to get what I like to call a vintage analog experience. Right, so this is it, the Sony a7R III with the Pancolar reflex 50mm f1.7, an M42 50mm lens. This is actually my wife's lens, but she has very kindly borrowed it to me for the purpose of making a review on the channel. So watch this space if you want to see a review for this in the near future. But let's show you how I've set up my camera for a very, almost like an analog experience. My purpose with this setup was to have everything available on the outside of the camera, because if there was one thing about the Fuji cameras that I loved a lot, like really a lot, was the fact that it had all the important controls outside of the camera. There was basically no need to go into the menus for anything current. And this is also the case for my setup here. Now, let us turn the camera on and tell you what each button does and how I've set everything up. First and foremost, I make quite a lot of use out of these three memory recall slots. I have set them according to my needs as follows. I have a 50mm black and white setup on one. I have a 35mm black and white setup on 3, and I have a 50mm color setup on 3. Now, when I say this, the focal length is only to designate what settings I have instructed the camera to use for the in-body stabilizer. It's also worth mentioning that all these three slots are basically sets of settings that I usually need, and they will be adjusted here and there according to my needs. And the gist of it is that it's basically all on aperture priority, because I shoot in aperture priority 99% of the time. That said, I have C1 set up as a mirroring mode switcher. My go-to mirroring mode is either multi or center, but I have also been known to use highlight protection mirroring modes. So this is on C1. The C2 is the switch to Super 35, otherwise known as crop mode. This is often useful when I want just a bit more reach. This C2 button is basically like a zoom. Let me try and see if I can see this thing. Yeah. Bam. This is just a Super 35 switch, a crop mode switch, and it works great, allowing me basically like two focal lengths for any lens I use. Now, the C3 button is a switch for the electronic shutter. I use it to switch on silent shooting, and I use this very rarely, but I do need it sometimes. I often shoot in churches, and it's basically there where I want to try and keep a low profile and be as discreet as I can. The C4 button is a drive mode selector. I'm 99% of the time using single shooting, but sometimes I've been known to use a self timer. I don't basically ever use brackets, maybe once or twice throughout the whole lifetime of a camera, but hey, it's there for when I need it. Let me show you how I've set up my function menu. I have a creative style here. I often switch between this and I love the clear style. I think it's really beautiful. Excellent colors, very vivid, very punchy, but I'm just mostly on black and white. Moving further to the right, I have a picture profile. This is for the very rare occasion when I shoot video with this camera, and I don't necessarily use log, but I keep it here mostly because it's hard to find otherwise. White balance is basically always on auto, but hey, sometimes I may need it. Then it's the minimum shutter speed for auto ISO. I basically park it at 1/125 and just leave it there forever. I find that 1/60 sometimes is going to make blurry images, but 1/125 almost always guarantees sharp images. And when that is not enough to freeze the motion, it's often the case that I even want a tiny bit of motion blur in my images. This is off and on for IBIS. It's basically always on, but I need it. Sometimes I may need to turn it off if I have the camera on a tripod or whatnot. And this is the focal length instruction for the stabilizer. You may ask how I've managed to get a single row of settings on the function menu. And it's the case that when you go to tab 2, I think it's page 8, on function menu settings, if you have all 6 of these set to not set, it will only just display a single row of settings here. I use the AF on button to punch in, basically zoom magnify, and punch in again for further magnifying. When I'm here, I use the joystick to move the area I want magnified, and the C4 button will center the focus magnifier window. I've chosen my initial focus magnifier to 6.2 because the default is 1, and I want to very quickly punch in to my subject all the way in, so I can very easily adjust focus. I will sometimes search for my subject with the joystick and use the C4 button to reset it to the center. Half press the shutter button to get out of the focus magnifier. The AL I have set to auto exposure lock. This is often useful because I will take a measurement from somewhere in my frame, lock the exposure there, and recompose. I use this a lot. I do this often because I sometimes may need the light condition from a certain part of my image, but if I'm properly framed, it's not where I want the exposure. I may also use this exposure compensation dial to change my exposure, but I often find that using the exposure lock and measuring somewhere and applying my measurement, let's say, to my desired shot, sometimes I find that works better. The upper part of the wheel is on its default setting and it cycles through screen displays. I usually use this with just the histogram. The left part is yet again drive mode, so I guess I have this doubled. I need to rethink this because this is redundant. I have drive mode on two places. The down arrow does nothing. This does nothing. This does nothing. Pressing on the joystick, pressing on the middle button. I still have plenty of room to set more custom settings, but I don't necessarily need any more than this. I have set my camera like this and it's working like a breeze. I don't see how I can... I mean, there's always ways to improve it, no doubt about that. But I've managed to find a setup that really works well for me. And these two wheels are basically useless for me. I wish there was a way to use these wheels to magnify my focus assist window, or even better yet, to move it, but hey, I have the joystick for that. There's this that I still want to show you. I love the fact that Sony offers my menu. It's the last tab in the menu where you can set your most used shortcuts to various settings inside the menu. And I've set them as follows. First up is where I customize or save memory recall slots, because I often have new ideas and change stuff here. Then it's format, because I basically always just use the camera to format my card. This is for shutting off all camera communications like wireless and Bluetooth, because if I sometimes need to transfer files off of my camera to my phone, it's then when I set this to off and go to send to smartphone. But otherwise, I want this to not emit or receive any sort of wireless communications in order to preserve battery. Sometimes I do sensor cleaning. I'm not even sure why I have this here, because ever since I learned how the electronic front curtain affects bokeh, I basically switched to fully mechanical shutter and never intend to shoot otherwise, except for the occasion when I need a silent shooter. But other than that, it's mechanical shutter only. On page 2 on my menu, I have peaking settings like levels and colors. Then it's zebra settings and settings for monitor and viewfinder brightness. This is still a work in progress. I have reached a very comfortable setup where everything is nicely laid out. All settings I need often on a day-to-day basis from minute to minute are on the outside of the camera. Aperture and focus are at my fingertips. Everything else is on the outside of the camera. I have my menus for all those settings that I use sometimes, but less often. And it's a very, very easy to use setup. I'm pretty happy with how I've managed to lay it all out. It's simple, it's easy, it's getting out of the way and allowing me to be creative and do photography. So that's my settings for basically everything that I shoot with this camera. Now that pretty much wraps it all up. I have been Radu. This has been 1,000 words on how I use this Sony a7R III, how I customize the buttons, how I strive to make my experience as pleasant as possible, and how I customize the computer with a image sensor that is the Sony a7R III to my quirky and strange personality that likes to have a vintage feel, an analog experience with a computer that takes pictures. That said, I hope you enjoyed this. Until next time, be well.